There are stories buried so deep in the soil of this country that sunlight never touches them, stories so twisted, so quietly monstrous, that entire towns have pretended they never happened. One such story begins in the hollows of Appalachia, where the mountains swallow secrets like dry earth swallowing rain. It starts with a family no one remembers by name, a family that lived quietly, invisibly, on the edges of the map. Their home was nothing more than a weathered cabin, its timbers bowed under decades of wind and neglect. But inside, the walls witnessed things that should never have been spoken aloud. Theirs was a desire that defied the most basic moral law, a hunger that clawed at the blood itself, and from it emerged a child whose very existence would unsettle anyone who dared imagine it. This child was not born of chance. Each generation that came before carried a shadow of obsession, a slow and deliberate weaving of bloodlines that no human should dare touch. It was a hidden experiment, unrecorded in any census or diary, conducted not by scientists, but by a family who mistook their own reflection for divinity. The air of the cabin was thick with inherited whispers. Stories passed quietly from parent to child about survival, about loyalty, about keeping the family whole above all else. But beneath those lessons lay a more sinister teaching, that the body of a child could be the canvas for a forbidden desire, and that the cost of such a desire was invisible until it could no longer be ignored. From the moment of the child's birth, something about him was immediately off, not in appearance alone, though his features carried an odd symmetry that unnerved the midwife. His eyes held a hollow echo of generations past, a clarity of lineage that made strangers recoil. The neighbors whispered, when they dared speak at all, that the boy seemed older than his years, that his gaze knew things no child should ever know. And yet the family celebrated him as if he were a triumph of their careful, secretive planning, a culmination of decades of isolation and obsessive control. In those hills, isolation was a protective shroud, and the family believed that no one outside could ever comprehend the choices they had made, choices that violated not only nature, but the fragile trust that binds human lives together. Even as he grew, the boy carried with him a weight that no child should bear. He inherited a mind sharpened by secrecy, instincts honed by the patterns of abuse that had been carefully buried beneath layers of everyday life. He learned to watch without being watched, to speak without being understood, and to move in a world that was already beginning to treat him as an anomaly. The mountains did not offer comfort. They offered the perfect concealment for something horrifying. The people who stumbled across the family would later describe an unease, a creeping sense that something fundamental was wrong. But few ever looked closer. No one wanted to uncover the truth that hid beneath the polite facades, because some stories are too dark to face, even when the light is invited in. And so, the child was raised, not as a normal boy, but as a living artifact of a taboo desire, a secret experiment in blood and will. Each day carried the weight of decisions made long before he existed. Every smile, every small act of learning, every heartbeat was a reminder that he was born not to a world that embraced him, but to a legacy that demanded he be perfect in its horror. Those who might have intervened were repelled quietly, instinctively, by the truth they sensed yet could not name, and the mountains watched, silent witnesses to a story that would not stay buried forever. The family's obsession was not something they admitted in conversation. They never spoke of it in letters, never wrote it down in journals, at least none that survived. It existed instead in gestures, in patterns, in the meticulous ways one generation was made to meet the next. Every marriage, every pairing was calculated, guided by a quiet arithmetic of blood. It was not lust in the conventional sense, not the thrill of fleeting desire, but something colder, more persistent, a fixation on purity of lineage, on recreating themselves in miniature, over and over, without ever acknowledging the monstrous truth behind their intent. The child, when he was very young, began to sense it, though he could not name it. There was a weight in the air, a tension that never lifted, a constant undercurrent of expectation that something unthinkable must happen to keep the family intact. He learned early the language of silence, the unspoken rules of the household that governed what could be seen, what could be heard, and what must never be questioned. The adults moved around him with the grace of predators, careful to maintain appearances while carrying out acts that were neither natural nor moral. Visitors were scarce, and when they came, they noticed only the surface: a polite smile, a tidy cabin, children who seemed bright and well kept. But the boy knew. He understood that the world beyond the hills was not for him, and that the boundaries his family had erected around their lives were walls meant to contain more than just their secrets. They were barriers to reality itself, shielding them from the judgment of any eyes that might see too clearly. The more he grew, the more obvious the consequences became. The child's body began to reflect the accumulated effects of generations of insular mating. Features repeated and doubled, creating an appearance that was unnervingly symmetrical, unnervingly deliberate. His intelligence was keen, but it carried a strain, a subtle fragility that made adults nervous in his presence. Small things would go wrong in the household, illnesses that defied explanation, behaviors that hinted at an inheritance no one dared discuss, and the child's uncanny awareness of them all. It was as if he could read the history of his family not from books, but from the lines in their faces, the cadence of their voices, the shadows that moved behind their eyes. He carried in himself a history that was both intimate and horrifying, one that no one else could truly comprehend. Outside the cabin, the world remained ignorant. Neighbors still exchanged polite nods across fences, still whispered about strange happenings in the hills, yet no one sought to dig too deep. The boy's existence, the culmination of obsession and secrecy, remained invisible, buried under layers of mundane life and rural isolation. But inside the walls, the tension was palpable. The adults were meticulous, almost ritualistic, in their care and control. Every meal, every lesson, every bedtime was a performance designed to preserve not just the boy, but the invisible threads that held the family's taboo desires together. Their meticulousness was not love, it was containment, a desperate effort to hold back the chaos of what they had created. And the child, young though he was, understood that he was both the vessel and the consequence of his family's choices. He was the result of generations that had been willing to sacrifice morality, love, and empathy in pursuit of their hidden ideal. And like all children who inherit secrets too heavy to bear, he learned to carry them silently, like a stone in the chest. It was in this silence, in this slow accumulation of awareness and dread, that his own identity began to fracture. He was not just a boy, he was an experiment, a warning, a living record of a family whose ambition had gone too far. As the boy approached adolescence, the consequences of his family's choices became impossible to ignore. He moved through the world like someone carrying a weight that others could feel, but could not name. His body was the product of repeated patterns, of generations carefully folded into one another, and it carried marks of both perfection and deformity, subtle enough to escape casual notice, yet impossible to ignore for those who looked closely. There was a tension in the air whenever he entered a room, a strange electricity that made others uneasy. He was a living mirror of a taboo desire, a reflection of something no society had sanctioned, and it showed not only in his features, but in the very way he moved, thought, and observed. His mind, sharpened by years of isolation, was both a weapon and a prison. He could read patterns where others saw chaos, anticipate actions before they occurred, and dissect motives with a precision that was terrifyingly beyond his years. And yet, these abilities were born from trauma, from an upbringing steeped in secrecy and manipulation. Every lesson the adults gave him carried a hidden weight, not instruction for survival, not guidance for morality, but preparation for a world that could never accept him. He learned quickly that truth was dangerous, that curiosity could be punished, and that obedience was the only way to survive the relentless scrutiny of the people who had created him. There were moments, brief and fragile, when he glimpsed what life might have been under normal circumstances. A neighbor child laughing freely, the taste of a wild berry plucked from a nearby ridge, a bird's call echoing through the mountains. In those fleeting moments, he experienced both joy and horror, knowing that these small freedoms were impossible for him. Every pleasure carried a shadow, the knowledge that he was born different, that he was both an object of obsession and a secret too dangerous to reveal. These shadows followed him relentlessly, weaving into his dreams and waking hours alike. He grew accustomed to hiding his reactions, hiding his thoughts, hiding the very essence of himself to survive in a world that could never see him without recoiling. The adults, meanwhile, continued their quiet rituals, subtle but persistent. Their obsession had a rhythm, the way they spoke, the way they touched, the way they arranged marriages and kinship. Everything was designed to keep the bloodline pure, to maintain the hidden experiment they had begun long before he existed. No one outside the cabin could understand, and perhaps it was better that way. The mountains were both protection and prison, shielding the family from outsiders while simultaneously ensuring that no escape was possible. And the child, growing into adolescence, began to understand that he was both captive and instrument. He existed not for his own sake, but as proof of something forbidden, a living testament to desires no one else could condone. At night, when the cabin was quiet and the wind rattled the boards, he would sometimes hear whispers, remnants of conversations not meant for him, the lingering echoes of past generations speaking across time. These whispers told him things he could never say aloud, that his life was a carefully orchestrated experiment, that every choice had been made long before he was born, that the very blood running through his veins was a product of obsession. It was a knowledge that isolated him further, making him both more aware and more alone. The child's existence had become a mirror reflecting the darkest corners of human desire, a reminder that some truths, no matter how carefully concealed, will always demand acknowledgement. The turning point came quietly, as all tragedies do, in a season when the hills seemed to close in tighter. Around the cabin, the child, now on the brink of adolescence, began to notice patterns in the adult's behavior that were no longer subtle. Conversations would halt abruptly when he entered a room. Hands that once carried tenderness now lingered too long, too deliberately. The lines between protection and obsession blurred, and he realized that the adults no longer viewed him as a boy. They saw him as the culmination of generations, a vessel into which they had poured every twisted desire and every unspoken fantasy. It was in those moments, sharp and inescapable, that he understood the depth of what had been done and the reality of what he had inherited. At first, he could only observe. He hid behind the corners of the cabin, behind the shadows cast by the firelight, listening to voices that were never meant for his ears. They spoke of the future in hushed tones, as though even the walls could not be trusted. Each word revealed a meticulous calculation of his life, a design that was far older and darker than he had ever imagined. He realized that his own body was not his own, that every feature, every instinct, every spark of intellect had been shaped by forces that were deliberate and unnatural. And yet there was no escape. Even the forests surrounding the cabin were no sanctuary. They were extensions of the family's control, a natural cage in which the boy had been born and bred. The psychological weight of these revelations pressed on him relentlessly. He began to experience nightmares not as dreams but as memories of events that had not yet occurred. Faces of ancestors he had never met appeared in the dark corners of his mind, each one carrying the same cold expectation, the same unyielding obsession. He saw the cabin itself as a living organism, its walls closing in with every secret kept, every boundary crossed. And in the silence, he could hear the soft, insistent hum of inevitability, that he was not merely a child, not merely a victim, but a continuation of something far older, something that refused to die quietly. Isolation became both punishment and shield. The boy withdrew from the few social interactions he was allowed, avoiding the fleeting kindness of neighbors and the curious glances of strangers. He knew that exposure could unravel the fragile veil of secrecy his family had maintained, and he understood that the consequences would not just be personal, they would be generational. He was a living record of a taboo, an embodiment of a desire too shameful to speak aloud, and he carried the weight of that truth in every step, in every glance, in every word left unspoken. By now, the child had begun to understand the power of knowledge. He realized that his awareness made him both dangerous and vulnerable. If he revealed what he knew, the entire structure of the family, the very history they had tried to erase, could collapse. And yet, to remain silent was to surrender entirely to the design imposed upon him. The tension was unbearable, a quiet horror that seeped into every corner of his existence. He learned to navigate it with precision, listening when he must, speaking when he must, watching always. In this way, he became both participant and observer, the heir not only of blood but of secrecy, and perhaps of an inevitability that no one, not even he, could escape. By the time he was in his mid-teens, the consequences of generations of insular obsession were undeniable. His body, mind, and very presence had become a manifestation of the family's relentless fixation. It was no longer a matter of subtle unease. The cabin itself seemed to pulse with expectation, as if every floorboard, every beam, had been waiting for this moment for decades. The adults treated him differently now, less like a child, more like an artifact, an object to be preserved, perfected, and controlled. Every glance, every word, every small touch was weighted with significance, carrying both praise and warning. And he, acutely aware of the gravity of his own existence, moved carefully through a world constructed entirely around the dark intentions of others. It was at this stage that the boy began to understand the true nature of the desire that had produced him. Not merely a genetic curiosity or a fixation on appearance, it was something deeper, a compulsion to perpetuate the family's obsession, to fold blood into blood until the origin of sin was impossible to trace. The adults spoke less of morality, more of survival, of loyalty, of the sacred duty to maintain the line. And in this way, the child became both witness and participant, the unknowing executor of plans he could never consent to, yet could not escape. Every action was observed, every reaction recorded, every mistake noted. In that cabin, normal childhood curiosity became dangerous, innocence became suspect, and the very act of breathing was a negotiation with a family whose love was inseparable from obsession. It is difficult to describe the psychological weight of knowing that your life is not your own. The boy carried it like a stone in his chest, heavy and unyielding, pressing him down with every passing day. He learned to cloak his emotions, to disguise fear as compliance, to smile when the situation demanded it, and to retreat into shadows when it did not. The adults believed he did not understand, that he was naive, malleable, unformed. But in truth, he observed, catalogued, and remembered everything. He saw the patterns in the conversations, the rhythm of the daily rituals, the deliberate manipulation of his thoughts and desires. And with every passing year, he internalized one immutable fact. He was the living record of a taboo, the embodiment of a family secret too dangerous to confront. Now, perhaps more than ever, the horror of his existence became social as well as personal. Any outside observer would have described him as uncanny, unnervingly precise in thought and action. Strangers noted something almost imperceptible in his behavior, a sharpness of gaze, an unrelenting stillness, a quiet sense that he knew far more than a boy should. Neighbors whispered, but never confronted, afraid that even the act of questioning could stir a truth too dark to endure. And in this isolation, he began to understand a terrifying duality. He was both monster and victim, the product of desire he had never expressed, yet a being compelled to embody it fully. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Because this story is not just about one boy in a cabin in Appalachia. It's about what happens when generations bend morality to desire, and the cost is paid not by the guilty, but by the ones born into it. In the quiet of the hills, the child, now nearly a young man, became a living record, a cautionary whisper of what secrecy, obsession, and inherited darkness can produce. Every glance, every gesture, every thought carried the weight of history, and it was a history that no one outside the cabin could truly comprehend. As the boy entered late adolescence, the physical and psychological toll of his family's obsession became unmistakable. His body, already marked by generations of insular breeding, exhibited traits both uncanny and unnerving. Limbs moved with an odd precision, gestures too controlled for comfort, expressions that carried a deliberate symmetry no natural childhood could produce. His face, too, betrayed the genetic echo of decades of secrecy, a strange harmony of features that unsettled those who dared look too long. He was not only a living record of his family's obsession, he was a warning, an embodiment of consequences that had been meticulously concealed, but could no longer be disguised. The mountains around the cabin seemed to lean in closer, watching, waiting, as if the land itself knew what was unfolding and recoiled quietly in horror. The boy's mind, sharpened by constant observation and isolation, had become a labyrinth of memory, calculation, and suppressed desire. He could anticipate the adult's intentions with unnerving accuracy. He noticed the subtle shifts in tone, the micro-expressions that betrayed hidden motives, and he catalogued every detail of the household as though his survival depended upon it, which, in truth, it did. Every decision his family made, every act of manipulation, was encoded into his consciousness, leaving him simultaneously empowered and imprisoned. He had learned that understanding the machinery of desire, of secrecy, and of obsession gave him leverage, yet offered no escape. Awareness was a double-edged sword. It made him vigilant, but also painfully aware of the weight of the generations that had crafted his very existence. The psychological horror of this life cannot be overstated. The nights were long and relentless, filled with dreams that were neither dreams nor memories, but an unsettling mix of both. Ancestors he had never met whispered through his mind, their voices carrying the same cold, calculated intent as the adults around him. He saw visions of futures he had no agency over, outcomes that had been predetermined by the obsessive rhythm of his family's decisions. Every sound in the cabin, every shadow, every creak of the wooden floor seemed loaded with meaning. He began to walk through the world not as a boy, but as a sentient repository of taboo knowledge, carrying a history no one else could touch without horror and disbelief. The adults around him, too, were changing their behavior, increasingly aware that he was more than a child. They had created a sentient mirror of their own obsession, and it was impossible to control fully. Their glances lingered longer, their instructions grew more rigid, and their secrets became both ritual and trap. They sought to maintain authority over him, yet each attempt only revealed the limits of their control. He understood the duality of his existence, a carefully groomed product of obsession, yet a mind capable of perceiving the structures that bound him. He lived within a fragile ecosystem of desire and secrecy, aware that any misstep could unravel the delicate veneer that had protected the family for decades. And yet, amidst all this, there was a quiet, horrifying resilience. The boy, burdened with the accumulated weight of generations, began to navigate the darkness with a subtle, almost invisible grace. He learned to conceal both fear and understanding, to move among his captors without revealing the depth of his knowledge, and to survive in a household that was as much a laboratory as it was a home. Every day, every interaction, every whispered conversation became a test of endurance, of wit, of subtle power. The boy had become a living archive of human obsession, a record of the consequences of desire untempered by morality, and a reminder that some truths, once set in motion, refused to remain hidden forever. The culmination of the boy's existence, of the generations that preceded him, came not with a dramatic confrontation, but with a quiet, inevitable reckoning. By the time he reached adulthood, he had become both monument and warning, a living testament to the perils of obsession carried across bloodlines. The family's original intent, the desire to preserve a perfect lineage, had succeeded in ways they could never have anticipated. Their creation had survived, yes, but it had also transformed, carrying within it a consciousness that could perceive, analyze, and perhaps even judge the very desires that had shaped it. The child, once innocent and unwitting, had become a sentinel of inherited darkness, a being whose very presence made moral boundaries tremble. Isolation, secrecy, and the meticulous control of the adults had shaped him, yet they had also failed to contain him fully. He had learned the rhythm of the household, the patterns of thought and expectation, and he had internalized them not to obey blindly, but to navigate, to survive, and to endure. He carried the weight of generations, a living archive of sins no one else could see or name. And in the stillness of the Appalachian hills, where the wind whispered through the trees like the faint echo of voices long gone, he began to understand the true horror of what it meant to be born of a taboo desire. He was at once victim, product, and observer, and his knowledge was a burden heavier than any physical weight he could bear. The adults, their obsession spent and crystallized in his very being, eventually began to fade, their influence waning with the inevitability of time. And yet, the legacy they had constructed remained indelible. The boy, now a man shaped by secrecy, fear, and calculated desire, carried within him not just his own life, but the echo of countless others who had been complicit in the creation of his existence. Every choice he would make, every relationship he would forge, every step into the outside world would carry the invisible imprint of the past. He had been born from an unthinkable desire, yet he had survived it, and in surviving, he had become the keeper of a family history too monstrous to share, too haunting to forget. And so the story concludes. though not with resolution or justice. There is no redemption here, no neat moral, only the enduring truth that some human obsessions, when left unchecked, can carve themselves into the very flesh of the next generation. The boy, the product of generations of insular desire, stands as a reminder that darkness can be inherited, that silence can be complicit, and that some truths are so deeply buried they can survive centuries, waiting for eyes bold or foolish enough to uncover them. In the stillness of the hills, the cabin remains, the bloodline endures, and the shadow of forbidden desire stretches far beyond the walls that once contained it. He is living proof that the consequences of obsession cannot be escaped. And the world, however unaware, carries a fragment of his story with it, hidden in plain sight, like a wound no one dares touch, like a history too terrible to be fully told. Some secrets, after all, refuse to die quietly.